In what ways does your neurodiverse condition interact with other aspects of your identity? Examples include race, gender, culture, sexuality, or other physical or mental disabilities.
I think one of the biggest things for me has been understanding how I communicate and understanding that through like a neurodiverse lens. So I have post-concussion syndrome. I had a traumatic brain injury. So some of my things are like, especially earlier on, I'm like 3 years post that injury, were not being able to like form language. Like I could, like in my brain, I could know what I wanted to say, but I couldn't find the words for it. And that's been pretty frustrating. And I think it's interacted with my identity as like a queer woman, as someone who's like mixed minority. I have like Pacific Islander heritage. There's some things around like invisibility and being silenced there that feel like challenging already. And so it's been tricky, and also I think taught me to trust my own intuition more, even if I maybe don't have like verbal language, just trying to honor that I still have something to like communicate, even if I like that verbal language doesn't exist.
How do you perceive neurotypical brains to work, and how would you describe the way your own brain works by comparison?
A keyword for me is capacity, and I've introduced that language a lot in my, like with my family, with friends, and had a speech therapist kind of use like a pie diagram to illustrate, like, you know, if we have our energy going towards like our emotions or our mental state or like organization or, you know, speech, like I would say for neurotypical people, it just seems that there's like a larger capacity to attend to like more things, more basic functions or essential functions at a time, and for their energy to be like less consumed by them. While as like someone who doesn't consider themselves neurotypical, I think that my energy runs out sooner. I have to like think about that essential energy being used a lot more. I'm like constantly thinking about my bandwidth and my capacity. Like even on this call, I'm thinking, okay, this is an hour on Zoom. I'm good for about 3 hours on Zoom a day before that's kind of my bandwidth. So there isn't an endless amount of capacity to do essential functions.
How did diagnosis change your outlook on yourself or your life?
It didn't change it a lot. It was relieving to have. It's mostly been relieving when it comes to asking for accommodations. Just when it comes to writing paperwork, it's relieving to have a name to call like some of what I feel versus having nothing at all, because it's really hard, you might know this, to like get resources and help when a condition is not diagnosed. So I think that's been the biggest thing. It's just made it easier for me to access resources that I need.
What's one piece of advice that you would give to neurodivergent people or like family and friends of neurodivergent people?
I think to read as many resources as you can. I gave family and friends like a book about TBI survivors pretty early on that my rehab program had given me. And it really took the pressure off of me having to verbalize what was going on for me, because that can be like just hard and traumatic in itself. Or it can be really healthy depending on what someone's condition is. So I think like educating oneself, and also not being afraid to ask questions. I think so often there's a huge barrier when we meet someone who's like quote unquote different, or we sense that there is. And I think that I just have really enjoyed when people aren't afraid to ask, you know, maybe stupid questions or like questions that seem a little bit uncomfortable, because it breaks that barrier of, you know, difference and curiosity. I don't think you can go wrong with.
If you could change one societal expectation, what would it be and why?
Maybe this is the perceived expectation, and I think it also has a lot to do with like like whiteness and lots of other like societal constructs. But I think the idea that everyone's on the same page. I'm in a bioethics class right now and we're talking about the pandemic and kind of this messaging that like we're all in this together around COVID-19. And in some ways I think that's a really lovely sentiment. And there's been times where I feel like we're all in this together, but then there's so many questions to be asked about that statement, like who is we and what are we in? What does together mean? So I think, yeah, I wish that the societal expectation that everyone's moving at the same pace or has the, I don't know, moves linearly, that there would be more question around that. Because from what I've found, being neurodiverse, and even for people who aren't, is that's just not the case. And that there's many, many different ways to like move and to achieve and to even just be present.
What is a common feature of the world, such as the built environment, websites, classrooms, etc., that is inaccessible to you that non-disabled people often don't think twice about?
Bright overhead lights. I feel really drained sometimes on campus because of the bright overhead lights. I like often have to step out of class because it's just a lot for me. Yeah, and then I think the way that classes are structured, like I'm in one class right now that feels fairly exclusive to people that have like a high reading capacity, that are like, yeah, learn by reading. There's not as many options for like auditory learners or visual learners, or versus another class I have, there's like a lot of options around that. I'm not giving one common feature, but that's, I think, awareness that options are possible.
So are there any other like closing comments or messages that you kind of want to send out to people who may be watching this interview in the future?
My entrance to being neurodivergent was because of an injury. So I've had the before after experience. And I think so, specifically speaking to anyone who's like had that experience of having an injury that changed the way that they interacted with the world on a neurological level, is I think the medical system in the United States is geared toward being like 100% medically well. And that was messaging that was fed to me really often, was like, okay, we wanted you to be, 100% better, back to where you were. And it took me like really a couple years to recognize that that wasn't going to happen, and that it was actually most healing for me to accept that I changed. And that was involved with a lot of grief and a lot of anger, and kind of that whole process of recognizing like I'm still me, but I've changed. And I just think that's something that doesn't get talked about often enough when it comes to like brain injury or similar injuries, is that like sometimes like we don't go back to how we were, but it doesn't mean that we like can't be ourselves. It's just like a way of changing that we weren't expecting or we're not familiar with. So I think encouragement that like it's possible. It's possible to like change because of an injury, and to, I think, for it to be something that turns positive, and to like seek out the support that enables, acceptance of that, rather than trying to like go back to whatever before was.